Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Beyond the Present podcast. My name is Daniel Morgan. I'm here joined by Poujix live from Canada. My man, buddy, how's it going?
Everything's going great. I'm loving the weather here today.
Awesome. Fantastic. And of course, today we have a special guest, which is a friend, basically, Kanwar Gill. My man, buddy, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So, first of all, I should tell you something. Kanwar, I would like to basically get to know you a bit more, and of course, our listeners as well. So, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I'm basically working right now full time, but I've been in Canada for about 8 years now.
That's right.
I did my undergrad here.
In which major?
I'm working now. I did computer science.
Fantastic. And Kenny, where are you from originally?
Originally, I'm from India.
Oh, from India. Fantastic. I heard a lot about your country, basically, and every Indian that I know is just such a nice person. So I just want to let you right now, right off the bat, pretty amazing. Glad to meet you here. And, of course, for both of you, Poujix and Kanwar, so you're both right now in Toronto, right?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes,
very well. So today's topic actually is about excuses. And why is it that people come up with excuses? So first, let's move on to Poujix here. Poujix, what is your definition of, excuses? Because a lot of people just don't believe they are using or coming up with excuses. They don't even know what they are. So what is exactly an excuse?
Yeah, so I think there are some times that you are not doing something or rather doing something, and then you come up with excuses, meaning you give reasons that to justify your action or inaction. And then that, if it's not really justifiable, rather you're trying to come up with something to justify yourself, that would become be known as excuse. Sometimes not doing something or doing something is out of your hand. That's acceptable. But
That's
then
right.
when you're just trying to make it acceptable, that becomes something we call coming up with excuses.
So true. And let's move on to Kenny. Kenny, what do you think about this matter? What is your definition of excuses?
I'm going to add on to Poujik's point, but what I think, what at the core of an excuse, what I think is an excuse itself is a mindset, and people who make excuse, they are in that mindset. So even if they eventually don't end up making an excuse, they might find, okay, wait, we're not making an excuse. That's not normal for us.
Exactly.
But it's also coming from the environment you're in, the people you hang out with. So it's a lot of association that you have with people around you.
That's right.
That can contribute to it, and that can contribute to your mindset. The stronger it gets, the harder it would be for you to get out of it or
So
to
true.
think outside of an excuse.
Absolutely true. You see, ultimately, people are going to basically make progress in their lives, or they're going to make excuses. There's no other way, because excuses simply allow people to somehow say, well, I don't have this and this and that, and I'm not doing this and this and that because because of this and this. So they literally spend all of that creative energy, all of that basically focus and attention on finding reasons why they can't get it, instead of actually going and get the damn thing. That's just I'm baffled by this whole concept, basically. So, Poujix, why do people come up with excuses in the first place? Like, why do they do that?
I think that this comes mostly from people having not enough belief in themselves, meaning that they don't believe that they can actually achieve something, and they're afraid to be judged by inaction or some sort of action that they did and it was, say, wrong. So I think that's just from just to try to make themselves feel better. I didn't do this because it's impossible, or I did this because there was no other way, or something like that.
So true. Exactly. And Kenny, what do you think? Why people just go out and just come up with excuses?
I think people essentially who come up with more excuses, they lack self-confidence.
That's right.
And also they find more comfort in coming up with an excuse versus facing or saying something that is more, at the core of it, taking more responsibility of your actions.
So true. It's all about, you mentioned
day,
actually, the whole issue of self-confidence and comfort. So they have no confidence to face the music, and at the same time they want to feel comfortable, so this excuse allows them to feel good about themselves without making any progress. That's right.
Now you can compare that with an example of, say, you're in the transit and the transit gets delayed. You can come with an excuse wherever you're going that, oh, the transit got delayed and blah, blah, blah. Or you can be like, okay, the transit got delayed and I know it's going to get late. So you can use that time to do something that can even help you where you're going.
That's so
You
true.
can maybe, if you're going to a meeting, you can actually read on something. You're going meeting somebody, you can read on something still.
That is so true. I agree with both of you in this regard. So ultimately, as we mentioned, and Kenny, you put it just pretty well here, ultimately it's about not having the confidence to face the music and, of course, wanting to feel good. Because ultimately, guys, excuses are work. It takes energy to create and come up with excuses. So guys who do this oftentimes want to feel better about themselves. And that is why I feel it's quite detrimental to one's success to even put all of that time and energy into coming up with excuses. Just makes no sense to me personally. So because of that, let's just somehow make our listeners aware of the importance of not coming up with excuses and doing something else. So Poujix, let's say we have a problem right now, and it's going to be a lot easier to simply go ahead and have an excuse about it all. So what do you think people could do instead of excuses?
Yeah, I think the first thing you gotta understand is that, as you mentioned, excuse is not gonna solve your problem.
Exactly.
And hence you don't want to do that. If you totally grasp this notion, if you completely understand it, I believe, you can then go ahead and be like, okay, what can make my life better?
Mm-hmm.
What can solve my problem?
That's right.
Then you will be able to go past excuses and complaining, rather do something productive that actually solves your problems.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step is complete awareness and grasp of this phenomenon called excuse making.
Wow. It's unbelievable. We also call this rationalization. Like, we have certain things. We say, like, you know what?
Exactly.
I have this because of this and that. It's pretty good. So, like, stop doing that. Just stop using your creative power in such a negative and destructive way. So true. Kenny, what do you think? What do people do instead?
I think one easy way to make this concise would be actions speak louder than words.
So true.
And at the core of it, if you're saying something, you're, like you said, you're spending your energy coming up with a legitimate excuse, and that time can be invested in actually doing it or progressing towards the actual result.
Let me just stop you right now, Kenny. Just one question. You mentioned a legitimate excuse. Do we have such thing as a legitimate excuse?
So that's a good point, and I think legitimate excuse would have a different definition for every person who makes excuses.
That's right.
Depending on what kind of event you're going to or what kind of excuse you're making, legitimate would also change depending on that context.
Interesting. So what's exactly a legitimate excuse in this case? Because let's be honest, if our listeners are now listening, if they say, you know what, Dan, I have an excuse, and this is a legitimate excuse, as Kenny said.
Right.
So this could be actually quite easy for people to use just a random excuse and call it legitimate.
Right. I can give you an example. So, for example, if the transit is delayed, now that is an excuse, but still you can make it. You're just going to be there late. Mm-hmm. So that wouldn't really qualify for a legitimate excuse. Mm-hmm. But if you have an emergency, say you yourself have a health emergency, or if a close family member or friend has a health emergency, then that would be a legitimate excuse, because then you have to drop everything and just get out of there and go where you want to go. So in that case, you're not thinking about anything else. Your focus changes.
Interesting. That's of course a great perspective overall.
Right.
But you're saying that anything that somehow truly prevents us from doing something, it could be a legitimate excuse. Let me go back to Poujix here. Poujix, what do you think about legitimate excuse versus illegitimate ones?
Right. I agree that there are some circumstances that you may not be able to manage or work around it. But for myself, because I understand that there is a chance that I may come up with quotes, end quotes, legitimate excuse, meaning come up with excuses and justify them, rationalize them to be legitimate. For my own sake, because I don't want this to become a rationalization process, I tell myself that the only legitimate excuse that I can have possibly is that I'm dead.
Exactly.
If I'm dead, that's fine.
This is my point right now, guys, because let's be honest. Is there such thing as a legitimate excuse? I think there is, for sure. But here's the problem with most of us. You see, most of us have grown up Literally doing all that we can to rationalize and come up with excuses. And because of this, it's kind of like a paper when you fold it on one side. If you want to bring it back to a normal direction, it just doesn't just flat on the surface. It just can't happen. So instead of that, you have to actually take that paper and fold it all the way back. That is, go to the extreme end, and only then that paper can actually be placed flat on the surface. Now, that's a metaphor for all psychological changes. You see, imagine you spend your whole life using every excuse that you possibly can not to achieve your goals. Now, if there is such a thing as a legitimate excuse, then you literally say, whatever happens, that's a legitimate excuse, man. I'm telling you, that's just right here. So because of this, I have a suggestion for those of us who might struggle with coming up with excuses, and that is, do not consider anything during the period where you're trying to change your behavior as legitimate excuse. Because are there such things? I mean, let's talk about, facts. Are there things that are objectively legitimate when it comes to excuses? Yes, of course there are. But in the process of changing your behavior, we go back to the same example, that paper thing. If you pull it to one side and if you fold it, then you cannot place it flat on the surface. The only way is to go the other extreme, fold it to the other extreme, and only then you can now make it balanced. So because of this, during the time when you're trying to change your behavior, I recommend not to think of anything as a legitimate excuse. I know it's not true. This is because in terms of when you look at this whole concept, in reality, there are a lot of excuses that are legitimate in nature. But once you assume there aren't, this actually motivates you to take a lot more action. However, after you've managed to get rid of your excusitis, let's call it that, excusitis, which is it's a disease like coming up with all kinds of excuses all the time. Once you cure your excusitis, you simply can actually go back to normal and then think of some legitimate excuses in that regard. That's of course a great point. Now, before going any further, though, because I like to speak from, our own lives. So, Poujix, yourself, did you have any problem in the past with excuses and just rationalization?
Oh, numerous amount. There's no doubt that I had. Yeah, I have to admit, and to some extent, I still do. I mean, it's not like it's gone.
That's
it's
right.
Not like it's completely vanished, but I think I've come a long way. I think I've managed to do much, much better.
That's
noticeable enough that I can understand its progress day to day. And that, in that sense, I think I'm on the right trajectory, but still lots of work to do for
Fantastic. Sure. And Kenny, how about yourself? Have you ever yourself have suffered from excusitis?
Oh, for sure. Any kind of context that I can imagine. For example, when I was in school, you're working on assignments, you're always kind of telling your mind, "Oh no, it's like 2 days away, and then you're gonna work on it." And then you work on it until the last day, and then you're just taking out time from another activity onto everything is now going towards the assignment. So I feel that's just it's found in abundance in the environment we live in, but it's just one thing that obviously you have to understand what you're doing, why are you doing it, and take action towards actually producing results and not making excuses.
Bravo. I love that. So let's move on to actually what happened that you guys decided to actually stop coming up with excuses. And Poujix, what are you doing these days to not allow yourself to come up with excuses, and what triggered your change?
Yeah, as I mentioned to you, like whenever you have to explain to yourself or somebody else that why you didn't or did do something, I consider that excuse for myself. I understand it's on the extreme side, meaning you mentioned legitimate excuse. Yeah, there are sometimes objectively legitimate excuses, but then I don't even allow myself those. I'm like, okay, even if those are true, assume responsibility. How can you make the best out of the bad situation?
So true.
You always want to have some sort of achievement. Even if something is disastrous, you can at least make it less bad. So let's do it. That would be not making excuses, not dodging the bullet, but actually embracing it.
Wow, man, I like that. You're like one of these, what was that, Braveheart or something? You jump on the bullet like, no, don't kill me instead. I like that. How about you, Kenny? Like, what triggered your change, and what are you doing these days to actually get rid of excusitis?
It's, I think, what I really follow is simple. And in terms of getting rid of it, just follow through with an action. And this action could be depending on what you're doing in your life, actually getting things done, for example.
That's right.
Not making excuses with a task that is given to you, but actually, like making small achievable steps, breaking it down into those steps and achieving those in a span of time. So the task in your hands eventually gets done on or before time. Not only does that, for me, creates a mindset where I'm constantly being creative around the idea of, okay, what can I do? If I get it done early, I can think about creative ways to make it better, make it more efficient. That can only happen if I have more time in my hands, at least when I've done the task. But if I'm even finding time hard to just get the first task done, then I wouldn't even have time to think about making it efficient.
Wonderful. Just love that a lot. So before going any further, though, I would like to actually talk about some of the most common excuses that we come up with in our personal and professional lives. Okay, so whether it is, I don't know, saying I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I'm too short, or I'm too tall, or whatever it is. So Poujix, what are some common excuses that you hear in the world of entrepreneurship and in the world of academia in general?
I believe that one of the most misunderstood excuse, I can say, not necessarily well, it is common, but I feel at some point people do really believe is legitimate. That I don't have time.
Oh yes.
I don't. I see that they do have time. It's just
they
a
have
matter
time
of
for playing, I don't know, Fruit Ninja or Angry Bird or something, or texting for hours on WhatsApp.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, let's talk about reading a book. It's just a common example. I can say, like, I don't have time to read a book. But then I see that, as you mentioned, for example, riding a subway and playing Angry Birds or something.
Exactly.
Then that is the time that you have, but you choose not to use to read a book. So it's a matter of priority rather than having the time or not. So that, I think, is one of the most common and, dangerously enough, one of the most misused, quote-unquote, again, legitimate excuse, which people think is legitimate, might not be true.
So true. Kenny, any such common excuse that you hear all the time?
Yeah, for sure. Just adding on to that point, like what you were describing earlier about age excuses, where people have the mindset, oh, they're too young to do a certain task, or they're too inexperienced to be doing it. What that does is that it takes away from you the time to actually do it, to actually thinking, okay, you're not even capable of doing it. That goes back to the idea of lacking self-confidence. And I feel that there's more, like, you can put health excuses in there. That's another common one.
Exactly.
There's age excuses. There are multiple more.
Lack of energy. I heard something like, I just don't have the energy, man, or that kind of stuff. I hear this a lot, actually. You're so right about this matter. And ultimately, as you all pointed out, these are not legitimate. Even if they are, you should assume they're not, because they're just stopping you from pursuing any, forward. If you don't have time, it simply means you're not willing to make the time. You don't have the right priorities. If you feel like you're too young or too old, well, guess what? You're just lying to yourself. And nowadays, what I love about this whole, new movement all around the world is the fact that the internet is changing everything. I mean, like, almost all of our excuses, particularly about entrepreneurship, all the excuses have gone out of the window, man, because now, thanks to the internet, everyone can start reaching out. And ultimately, if you're not going for your dream, as an entrepreneur, for example, as a business individual, or in academia, it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, you're just lying to yourself, because now a lot of our limitations have simply been removed thanks to the internet, thanks to new technologies, and the fact that we can just access all types of information just one tap. Just pretty amazing stuff overall. So you all mentioned some of the common excuses, basically, and you talked about the fact that ultimately you should not think of them as legitimate. But right now, let us go for some step-by-step solutions to help our listeners get out of their habits, starting from today. So Poujix, right now, let's say we have a listener who knows, who basically he or she is coming up with a lot of excuses. What are some step-by-step plan that he or she could implement from today in order to get rid of that excuse, coming up with excuses and that excusitis?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, this whole phenomena is just a mindset, and you want to develop And to get rid of a mindset, you want to develop a substitute for it. So the substitute mindset, I don't know, it can be lack of excuse mindset or whatever you want to call it.
That's right.
In order to be able to do that is the first step is to notice your excuses. And we agreed that somebody who has already agreed is listening, for example, to this conversation. And the next step is, because even if you notice it, you still are going to make excuses no matter what. So now the time is to catch yourself. Okay, this is an excuse. So I'm not going to allow myself to abide by this excuse. I'm going to come up with the solution.
That's right.
And you keep practicing this process. At first, you're going to have miserable amount of failures, but then this number declines, gets better and gets better. It's like training a muscle.
Exactly.
It gets you fail many times to lift the weight, but at some point you're going to achieve doing it.
Fantastic. Kenny, what are your solutions for those of our listeners who might want to get rid of their habit of coming up with excuses?
I think changing the mindset is a key. And also you want to know when you'll have a tendency of making or coming up with an excuse.
That's right.
And like Poujix said, catching yourself. And that does take more responsibility on your end. But also you have to line that up with something that you get as a result out of it. So say you did not make an excuse, but you went through and then you accomplished a task. If that's followed by reward that you personally reward yourself, then that would be a good positive cycle that you can reinforce to change that mindset.
Fantastic. You see, guys, you heard it all. To our dear listeners out there, you heard it all. Ultimately, whatever excuse you have right now, I don't have the kind of business that I want. I'm not in a relationship that I want. I'm not with this guy. I'm not with that person. You just have a lot of these excuses right now. I know. But the fact of the matter is, you heard us saying, ultimately, most, if not all of those excuses are false and they're stopping and holding you back. So because of that, you actually need to focus your attention on using these techniques to get rid of this negative, destructive habit of coming up with excuses all the time, and instead use the same energy, the same time on basically moving forward and making progress. I repeat, the winners make progress while the losers make excuses. So guys, let's go for a final comment now to wrap up the show. Poujix, after all that we talked, what is now your final thought?
As always, I think one of the most important things we want to acknowledge here is that action. You can hear all this thing, or you can listen to much more, you can read many books, you can do a lot of these things, but if you don't actually do practice, put it into action, it's all for nothing.
So true.
So I would say, don't wait for tomorrow, don't wait for an hour from now, start catching your excuses right this second.
So
right
true.
This second. If you have an excuse not to finish this audio, catch yourself.
Exactly.
This is an excuse, and keep building on it.
Fantastic. And Kenny, what is your final comment?
I would just say that anytime you're thinking of coming up with an excuse, just get away or catch yourself, be more self-aware, and you might find yourself in times when you're coming up with the same excuse multiple times. That would be a good realization, because then you're knowing, okay, what kind of things are in your head, and then you can consciously make small steps to get away from it. And at the end of it, anytime, any task you have at your hands, anything you really want to achieve in your life, you should always have the mindset of just do it, which is what I love Nike for. Their logo and their slogan is so succinct and to the point that it's just it basically reveals that there's only action that can lead you to your results.
Absolutely. Action means everything. So guys, you heard it. Whatever excuse you have right now, get rid of it and do what Nike says. Just do it. And of course, that's all the time we have for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them on our website as well as on Podbean. And of course, if you're on iTunes, please do us a favor and leave some ratings as well as reviews so we can actually reach a wider audience. This is Daniel Mulligan, and this was Beyond the Present podcast. Thank you very much.